If you're like me and you were reading Bleach on a weekly basis before the final arc came out, you might remember there was a brief period of time after The Lost Agent, but before the Thousand Year Blood War, where Kubo took a 3-week break to prepare for that final story. Now, I remember this period very well. I remember speculation was just running absolutely rife as to what this final arc was actually going to be about, if we were going to get to see all the Bankai, if we were going to get to see the Royal Guard, stuff like that. Just crazy things that people were predicting all over the place. And Shonen Jump and Kubo didn't leave us out in the cold completely. Over that 3-week period while we were waiting for the first chapter of the last arc to come out, Shonen Jump released a series of articles, interviews and insights into the planning process of the final arc called Bleach Repeat and Reboot. Now these 3 weeks were actually filled with quite a bit of information and some tidbits which I think have some real prescience now that we've actually read the entire series. I remember absolutely lapping this information up when I was younger, waiting for these chapters to come out. But now I want to take a look back at Repeat and Reboot and take a retrospective look at these 3 weeks and the articles and insights that we were given and see how much of it actually came true in the final arc. Kubo gave quite a few interviews during this period of time, and I want to see how much of what he actually said stuck when the final arc finally came around. Before we begin though guys, if you're interested in Bleach videos just like this one and you want that Bleach content every single week, then hit the subscribe button and support the channel and I would really appreciate it. So let's get on with this then, and each one of these Repeat and Reboot volumes is broken down in a pretty similar way. Each week Kubo gave an interview that kind of detailed some of the changes to certain members of the Gotei 13, and then they talked about some extra information about where the story was headed and things that Kubo wanted to do and show in the final arc that I thought was really interesting back in the day, but now I'm interested to see actually how much of that Kubo managed to stick to and how much he managed to achieve in the final arc. So volume 1 of Repeat and Reboot, which was named Birth, was kind of an introductory volume to these 3 weeks, where it kind of laid the foundations for some of the interesting things we might find out, but it did tell us a few tidbits about the first 4 captains in the Gotei 13. Firstly, we had the Captain Commander, Yamamoto, and while Kubo does point out that it's very unlikely Yamamoto would have increased in power during the 2 years from the Aizen battle till now, he has actually had some unseen inner changes. What's really cool about this is we do actually see this manifest in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, and of course the changes that Kubo's talking about stem from the fact that Yamamoto has softened to the point where he's willing to break Soul Society law and help Ichigo get his powers back at the end of The Lost Agent. In the end, this all comes full circle for Yamamoto, however, as it leads to his downfall at the very start of the final arc, where he's killed by Yuha Baha, who claims that he's become simply too weak to even rely on a human to get his arm back, and thus didn't even make the 5 war potentials. It's honestly really cool seeing how Kubo clearly had this plan for Yamamoto from quite an early on point, where he's changed even just a little bit inside, but unfortunately that little chip in a millennia-old statue eventually brought the whole thing crumbling down. Moving on, we actually get some information about Rose, and it's actually the first time we see his time-skip look, as he doesn't appear in the Lost Agent arc. Kubo uses the final chapter in that arc to reveal to us that Kensei and Shinji have both joined the Gotei 13 again after the battle with Aizen, and while we all assumed that Rose probably had as well, we never actually saw him. So this is the first time we get to see how he appears post-time skip, and personally, I really like this look. I think it's way cooler than any of his previous looks, and yeah, I think he looks like a total badass, and this was a really cool little piece of information. But the first piece of really juicy information in Repeat and Reboot, in my opinion, comes about Captain Hana. And this is also where it gets a little bit dicey, in my opinion, as to whether or not Kubo actually stuck to what he said he was going to do. Now, for the longest time, we've always known there's been something up with Hana. She's a bit of a strange character with clearly something going on in her past. Whether that's because of the creepy faces she makes that terrifies even the 11th Division, or the fact that she's able to scare Kyoraku and Ukitake, there's definitely something going on with this character. And I remember for the longest time, even back in the Arrancar arc, Kubo promised that she'd eventually fight someone. So in Repeat and Reboot, the Hana section opens with Hana, who will finally turn her Zanpakuto against the enemy and enter battle. And then Kubo is asked very bluntly by the interviewer, will Hana finally fight? Kubo replies with, in the next arc, I've decided that Hana will enter the battlefield. Her Zanpakuto's true form will also be revealed. I can add that when Hana fights, she unravels her large braid. Now, if we unpack that just a little bit, we can already see that there may be some inconsistencies with how that turns out in the final arc itself. Yes, Hana does finally get a fight, but she's not fighting the enemy, she fights Kenpachi Zaraki. I suppose when Kubo says that her Zanpakuto's true form will be revealed, perhaps he's referring to her Bankai, and yeah, we do get to see that, but it doesn't get explained in the slightest. And yeah, she does unravel her huge braid. I honestly thought the Unohana Kenpachi fight was really cool, but I know it's not what people wanted. I know people wanted to see her go crazy against a couple of Stern Ritter. So it is a little disappointing that Kubo chose to just kill her off after this fight, and I don't think it's fair to say that she enters the battlefield and turns against an enemy. Really, she was a glorified training segment, but I think that Kubo definitely tried to squeeze her in this arc somewhere. I just think she probably could have survived. Perhaps the final most interesting part from Repeat and Reboot Volume 1 is how Kubo detailed that each of the major story arcs was based on one of Ichigo's friends, and therefore that arc essentially revolved around that character in some way. The Soul Society arc was considered to be Rukia's arc, the Arrancar arc Orahime's, the Fullbring arc Chad's, even though he gets knocked out and doesn't even really participate in the final battle. And then it said the final arc will belong to who? And I think every single one of us assumed it was going to be Uryu, and I think that was a big part in us believing that the Quincy were going to come back. It made perfect sense for the Quincy's to be the villains if Uryu was going to be one of the major players of this arc. Moving on to week 2 of Repeat and Reboot, known as Stage. This was honestly the really exciting week for me, where we finally got some sketches that actually showed new stuff coming to the final arc. We got to see the new battlefield and what would turn out to be the Quincy's home. Regarding the tidbits about the Gotei 13, in this one we get to look at squads 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. Most of the talk that Kubo gives is all about aesthetic changes, but there are some interesting parts about this that we really should look at. The first one, in my opinion, is about Renji, where Kubo notes that Renji's Bankai has already changed. I remember reading that, and I remember at the start of the final arc, Kubo goes out of his way to not show Renji's Bankai. Renji's about to use Bankai against Asnot, but then Byakuya stops him from using it. And I remember thinking, back to this interview, Renji's Bankai has obviously already changed, so Kubo's trying to hide it and keep it a secret and reveal it later on. But no, that's actually not true at all. Renji's Bankai changes later on in the arc, during the Master Masculine fight. So it's a little bit weird. Maybe Kubo's thinking, I've already changed his Bankai in my head, but it hasn't actually changed in the story. Either way, he's clearly alluding to Soho Zabimari, which is the Bankai's true form, but it actually hasn't happened just yet, so that was a bit weird. It's interesting that Komamura, who has quite a dramatic arc in this story, doesn't get any kind of mention for that whatsoever. His bit is literally just about his look and how it's changed. Moving on to Squad 8 now, we get to learn a little bit about where Kubo was planning on taking Kyoraku in the final arc, and honestly I think he delivered on every aspect of that character. He mentions here in Repeat and Reboot that Kyoraku's colourful Hayori contains a hidden history, and we'll learn the origins of it in the final arc. And yeah, that actually completely happens. We find out that Kyoraku got not only his Hayori, but also his hairpins from the loss of his own brother, and also Nanao's mother, and that all kind of comes together to form the character of Kyoraku today. And I actually thought that was really cool that Kubo went ahead and devoted time to giving us that part of Shinsui's backstory. And in fact, Shinsui's one of the characters who benefits the most in the final arc, in my opinion. I've also always loved Kubo's complete nonchalant attitude towards Bankai's being revealed, and he just doesn't seem to be that bothered. Bankai, in my opinion, never seems to be, from what I gather in these interviews, Kubo's main focus. It very much feels like he gets asked about Bankai's, and he's just kind of like, yeah, maybe. You know, I'm focused on the story, but I know you guys love Bankai, so sure, why not? And we get that very much here. He's basically like, I guess Shinsui will go Bankai at some point in the final arc. We all kind of expected it. It's kind of weird. Thinking back now, Kyoraku was very much one of the characters who we really felt were guaranteed to see his Bankai. And I think that's because of the tease that Okitake gives in the Fate Karakura Town arc. But Kubo seems to have always been pestered about Kyoraku's Bankai in interviews. I remember reading it constantly, and he's always just sort of been like, yeah, Kyoraku will release his Bankai at some point in the future. And obviously we do get it in his fight against Lille, so that's actually really cool that Kubo went ahead and did that. However, this next section is the bulk of what's truly interesting in Repeat and Reboot. This was when we got our first look at the new location of the final arc, and also Kubo detailed some plans about returning characters. So firstly I want to go over the sketches that we got for Silburn and the Shatten Bayrake, which would eventually be revealed to be the Quincy's homeworld. Kubo's comment regarding the Shatten Bayrake here is that although it's a new location, it's actually unexpectedly close, and perhaps even directly underneath something that we already know, although the location is not in Karakura Town or Soul Society. While this was very bewildering back in the day, obviously it turned out to be completely true. The Schattenbayreich is unexpectedly close and directly underneath the Soul Society, but it is not the Soul Society itself. It is on the almost like the mirrorverse of the Soul Society, and it exists entirely in its shadows. So I think that was actually really cool. Little hint that Kubo dropped there before the arc even began. Kubo's description of this new area, which he called a palace of ice, where the colours are going to be mostly whites, blues and silvers, also led credence to the idea that the villains were going to be Quincy's, as obviously those three colours are like basically the bread and butter of the Quincy army. What's weird to me though is these two sketches that we get to see of the Vandenreich's location. One of them is never used in the manga. Obviously this first one is Silburn, we get to see it look exactly like that in the manga at one point, but this one, it seems to focus on a huge waterfall that you can kind of make out what looks like the palace structure on top of that. To me, it looks like almost like a mixture of how the royal realm looks once the Quincy take over it and something completely new. This giant waterfall, which is even mentioned in the interview itself, never shows up in the manga. And I think it's just really interesting insight. Perhaps this is actually what Silburn looks like from far, far away, or it's just a design that Kubo never did anything with. But either way, I think it's super interesting to see what could have been for the Quincy realm. Personally, I kind of wish that we had seen more of the Quincy realm, because although Kubo says he wanted to draw a palace of ice, which is what he does draw, that's essentially all he draws. We never really see any more of the Schattenbayreich other than the streets of the Quincy city, and then eventually Varvelt when he takes over the royal palace. But in terms of actual landscapes and stuff like that, there really is none of that. And maybe there is none of that, because obviously they are located inside the shadows of the Seirete. But just from this kind of tantalising image, I'd have loved to have seen more of the kind of natural landscape that surrounded the Quincy Palace. This next section as well is really interesting in my opinion. It details how many Arrancar, if any, were going to appear in the final arc. I think most of us probably expected them to in some way, including Grimjo, who was never officially killed off in the series. He was just kind of left in limbo. It was really weird. I don't know if you actually remember, but back in the day, we had to wait so long to find out anything about Grimjo. It was left really strangely. The last panel you ever see of him is just his face after, like, Ichigo has saved his life from Neutra, and then he never comes back until way into the final arc. So that was kind of weird, but this part about the Arrancar was really interesting to read. Kubo states that he believes if the Arrancar do appear, they will in fact side with the Shinigami, though he's quick to put down that Ulquiorra has in fact turned to ash and is probably not going to appear. He does, however, say that Grimjo might become a friend, which obviously does happen in the final arc, though friend is putting it lightly, but it's interesting again how he would reveal something like this. That doesn't happen for ages. Like, I know Grimjo appears early on in the arc to kill Kurge, but you don't actually see him until, like, what, 624? So it's really interesting that Kubo would drop that hint this early on. Kubo also states that he wonders how he'd make Harabel appear, who is still alive. And again, it's interesting he mentions that, because if you hadn't seen Nestle tonight, you'd have no idea that Harabel was actually still alive, and that she would randomly show up at the start of the final arc. He states that he doesn't know how he would get them to leave Hueco but if the Arrancar did appear, they would appear as a group and not individually. Now, that's kind of true. Most of the Arrancar do appear as a group, but there are multiple groups of Arrancar that appear in the final arc. You have the Tresbestias and Loli and Menoli, who appear at the very start and they get wiped out by Kurge. Then later on you have Kurotsuchi's corpse unit of Arrancars who show up, and then of course finally you get Grimjo and Nell kind of working together with Ichigo's main group. So they do appear together, but it is also in individual groups, so I'm not sure if that's exactly what Kubo meant. The interviewer then asks what about Nell, and Kubo says, I think I'll let Nell appear. And of course he does. Nell does show up in the final arc. Again, it's really weird. Like, if you read Bleach in bulk, you might not be aware of the amount of time these characters were missing in action for, but Nell was not seen for ages. Like, she was a major character in the Hueco arc, and she's just gone. She is completely gone after the Neutra fight and does not show up again for ages. So, like, it was a big deal for Kubo to be like, yeah, I think Nell will appear in this arc. And yeah, she does, really early on. So, if one of the things I love about the final arc is, although a lot of the characters probably didn't quite have the showing that we wanted them to, it's really cool how many characters diverge onto this one storyline from so many different corners of the Bleach universe. I remember this next section causing some real controversy amongst the fans. Basically, the editor of this interview makes some predictions about which Espada he thinks are likely to show up in the final arc. He crosses off the ones who he thinks are definitely dead, so that includes characters like Yami and Ulquiorra. And then he gives two predictions that he thinks are very likely, which is Grimjo and Nell, and of course both of those were right. He says that Harabel is very unlikely, which is wrong. Harabel does show up, even if it's only once. And then he says that Neutra and Zamari are very unlikely. And I remember this set the fan base completely ablaze. Is Neutra still alive? Is Zamari still alive? How are these characters possibly alive? This guy has insider information. And yeah, it turned out that they're dead. They literally never show up again. But it was still really... I remember being completely swept up in that back in the day and thinking, oh my god, maybe Neutra is alive somehow. But it wasn't to be. Finally, Volume 3 of Repeat and Reboot, which is known as Restart. And I was getting really excited by this point because we were 1 week away from the final arc beginning. And some of the information given in this one basically detailed the fact that Kubo had been planning the 1,000-Year Blood War arc for about 5 years, which is kind of crazy, and with some of the stuff that happens, a little unbelievable. But, you know, I'm not one to question that. Maybe he was, but it's very interesting to read nonetheless. Now, this one with the Gote 13 focuses on squads 10, 11, 12, and 13. Probably the most important one here is Mayuri, because we get to see the others in the Lost Agent arc. Mayuri did not appear in that arc at all, so here we get to see his final arc appearance, or the first one anyway. And then Kubo does this really cool thing where he has a bunch of other like Mayuri faces, which I think was really interesting to see. I personally kind of thought that Mayuri was going to swap them out a bit more often in the final arc because of this, but he doesn't. He basically only uses the one that we get to see at the top there. Now, there are a couple of interesting tidbits about other captains, however, that I do want to go over, starting with the 10th Division. Kubo seems to drop some hints about adult Hitsugaya, implying to me that he has been planned since the start of this arc. I know a lot of people felt like that came out of nowhere, but if you read what Kubo says in this interview, probably not actually. Kubo states during this interview that during the 17 months of training after the Aizen fight, Hitsugaya has in fact completed his Bankai, and that so far up until now, when the petals disappeared, his Bankai would be removed. However, now that might be changed, ... And obviously that is implying that something different happens, and we know he turns into adult Hitsugaya. So whether Kubo had that plan from the start is interesting, but maybe he just knew that something was going to change in the future. It also says here that Rangiku's past will be important to the plot. Well, that's not true. That never comes up again, and Matsumoto plays pretty much the smallest role she has ever had in this arc. I always found that really weird. This is one of the things that Kubo has been going on about for a long time now, Rangiku's past. You know, people thought that Rangiku's past was like one of his 4th level secrets, but no, it basically never comes up. It's obviously important to Gin, and the fact that her part of her stole was shaved away to help create Aizen's Hogyoku, but furthermore than that, it's pretty meaningless. Now, a couple of interesting things are said here about Kenpachi, which I think directly contradict things that Kubo said in the final arc itself. Basically, the interviewer said, can Kenpachi ever achieve Shikai or Bankai? And Kubo corrects him and basically says, Kenpachi's Shikai is in a constantly released state, so it's already in its Shikai state. Now, maybe Kubo just didn't want to give away the fact that he was planning on actually giving Kenpachi a Shikai, but it's also a well-known fact that we thought that Kenpachi Zanpakuto was in constant release Shikai this whole time. So, did Kubo just decide to do that on the fly and give him a Shikai? I don't really know. I do think it probably is one of the cooler things in the final arc, though, to give Kenpachi the name of his Zanpakuto and stuff like that. So, if Kubo had it planned, I could see why he'd keep it a secret, but it is also funny to go back and see this interview where he completely contradicts what actually happens in the final arc. He also says that he always wanted to draw the story where Kenpachi became a captain, and obviously that's when he kills Kenpachi Giganjo, who basically looks like Yami. And although we don't really get to see that, we do get to see him call out Giganjo in a flashback. It's literally 2 panels long during the fight with Hana, and that's really cool because although Kubo says he wanted to draw it and probably couldn't find the time, it's nice that we got a couple of panels, and it's really cool to see Giganjo actually in the canon manga. Now, this next part about Mayuri is also something that seems to kind of contradict what happens in the final arc entirely. They make a big point about Mayuri's research being the key to the final arc. And now what I assume that to mean is the fact that he once researched the Quincy, because obviously the Quincy are the main bad guys of the final arc. But then they big up the fact that Mayuri found those corpses in Zale's lab, and how that would also be incredibly important. And while this interview says that those bodies that he found will actually make up a major part of the final arc, again, that's just not true. Although the bodies do come into play in some form, it's just a cool throwback to some of the past Arrancar who were killed. They show up for the Giselle fight, and then they never show up again. And finally, just a little bit of information about Rukia becoming a lieutenant. Kubo says that he wanted to draw how Rukia felt about becoming a lieutenant, but he felt it would take up a lot of chapters, so instead he was going to do it through flashbacks. But again, that never really surfaces in the final arc whatsoever. We don't really get to find out anything about how Rukia felt about becoming a lieutenant. We know that she wanted Byakuya to acknowledge her strength, which we get in the Asnot fight, but apart from that, this is again something that Kubo didn't really seem to find the time to do in the final arc. And finally, the last thing we got in Repeat and Reboot is also very, very interesting, and it's basically plot points that they predicted that we would find out the answers to in the final arc. So let's just go through them and see how many we did actually see answered. Now, the first plot point they said would be revealed was the mystery of Ichigo's birth, and that's the fact that Aizen said that he knew all about Ichigo from the moment he was born, and yeah, this was on everyone's minds, and yeah, I think the final arc does cover this. We get an entire mini-arc called Everything But the Rain, which details how Ichigo's parents met, and the strangeness of their circumstances, the fact that Isshin was a Shinigami, Misaki was a human/Quincy, but she also gets bitten by a hollow, and the fact that Aizen is completely aware of all of this. I think one of the best things about the final arc is Everything But the Rain, and it really tied up the mystery of Ichigo's birth and his power really well. The next mystery, however, I don't think the final arc touches on at all, but please let me know if I'm mistaken, and that's the fact that Ichigo is apparently a true blood. What it talks about here is that Grand Fisher says that Ichigo, his power level makes sense because he's a true blood, but I don't think we ever find out what that means. Now, I'm assuming it's referring to the fact that Isshin is a Shinigami. If that's the case, then there's no answer for that in the final arc. It's already known. So that's a bit of a weird one. I'm not entirely sure what that's all about, and I don't think that's really touched on. Next up, we talk about Isshin and Ryuken's deep bond. They seem to be hiding something in their past, and yeah, this is all explained, again, in the Everything But the Rain arc, how the two meet each other, how they don't really bond over Misaki, but they bond over their shared guilt and responsibility, I suppose. And again, I think it was handled really well, although we don't get to see enough of them in the present timeline. The next one is the similarity between Ichigo and Kaien that confused Iwanukitake. And yet again, this is another thing that I would say is completely much explained in the final arc. It's the fact that Ichigo is distantly related to the Shiba clan through Isshin. I think it makes complete sense. Again, it's just a coincidence that they look like each other, but it is supposed to reference that familial relationship. Interestingly here, another plot point they detail is the fact that Masaki's death, the truth, is not actually known yet. And yeah, this is another thing that the final arc goes into. For the longest time we thought she was killed by Grand Fisher, and while she technically was, it was only because Yuha Waha initiated the Auswahlen and stole her powers from her. So yeah, her death was because of the Quincy's, and that is addressed in the final arc. The next one is probably the most contentious one for me, and it's that being that Aizen loathed so much, the Spirit King. And we do find out a tiny bit about the king himself. We get to see him, which is a good thing. We get to find out what his purpose is, but in the final arc we don't really find out much more than that at all, but perhaps that's all we really needed. Kubo says that he wants to let the Zero Division appear, and we'll actually finally see them all and find out what they can do. And again, this kind of happens. We do get to see all of the Zero Squad, we get to spend some time with them all, and Ichibei gets a proper fight. I will agree, though, that some of the other characters do get shafted pretty hard, and by that I mean all of the other characters, because none of the other Royal Guard do anything, basically, which is a big shame. Kubo does spend some time with them, but it's definitely not what we wanted. Ichibei's fight is incredibly good, but the others don't get any real screen time after that, so that's a real shame. It's mentioned that we will discover the truth about Yoruichi and Urahara's true bond and their past together, and unfortunately that does not happen in the final arc. I personally was really expecting this during the Askin fight, because we'd had flashbacks for Mayuri and Kyoraku, but we don't get anything for Urahara and Yoruichi during their fight together, which is a real shame. And I think it's due to the fact that Kubo was having to turn up the pace a little bit after those long fights. But yeah, it's definitely a shame. We know that they kind of grew up together, I think along with Tessai. I think that's alluded to in the Turn Back the Pendulum arc. But yeah, it's a shame that Kubo never went into detail about that. And then the last storyline they mention is the fact that we will find out what happened to the rest of the Vizards, and yeah, we do, and it's nothing really that special. They're just still in Karakura Town, and they barely show up in the final arc. The last bit I want to go over really quickly is the fact that they talk about what it would take to bring the Squad Zero down to help the Soul Society. And this is something I've been wondering for a while up until this point, because if Aizen rampaging through the Soul Society isn't enough, then what is? And the interviewer says, would it have to be a really serious event? And to which Kubo replies, yes, it's going to be an event that will reduce the Seirei to ruins and cause the Shinigami to cry out in anguish. I remember reading that and being like, what is that going to be? And of course we find out it's the first Quincy invasion that does decimate the Soul Society entirely and leave Yamamoto dead. So I think that was a really strong opener to the final arc, and I was super hyped to see what was next. So there we have it. I hope you enjoyed that retrospective look at Bleach, Repeat and Reboot. The articles, interviews and insights we got during the 3-week break between the Lost Agent and the final arc. I remember being incredibly excited for the final arc to come out, and in my eyes it mostly fulfilled everything I wanted it to. And I think Kubo did a pretty good job at making good on all the promises he said he would in these interviews, including the Bankais, the histories, and the enemies and stuff like that. There were definitely some missteps like Rangiku's past, Urahara and Yoruichi's special past and stuff like that. There are some things that we didn't get to see, but I think on the most part, Kubo did a pretty good job. But that's it for this video then, guys. Sorry it's been a bit of a longer one, but I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you liked seeing the Bleach Repeat and Reboot, and if you, like me, were reading it back then, hopefully that brought back some nostalgia for you, because I remember always being so excited by these Kubo interviews. But until next time, guys, if you want to hit that subscribe button and support the channel, I'd love it. Don't forget as well to hit the notification bell. I've been forgetting to mention that, but yeah, if you want to do that, that would be awesome. But until next time, guys, I shall catch you later. See you then.